This is Domain 1, Access Control of the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification, or CMMC. So we'll go through the objective of the domain in its entirety, the objectives of each practice within the domain, some descriptions on levels and practices, and a knowledge check. So the domain objective: access control activities ensure that access granted to the systems of the organization and information is commensurate with the defined access requirements of that organization. Access requirements are developed based on needs of the organization, balanced with the security requirements needed to protect the assets of that organization. So the practice objectives. So they're all listed here, but we're going to go through each of them. So just a few: limit information system access to authorized users, processing acting on behalf of authorized users or devices, control the flow of CUI, separation of duties, limit unsuccessful logon attempts, terminate a user session after a defined condition. And again, we're going to go through each one. So the access control domain is one of the 6 domains involved in level 1, with a total of 22 practices. Spanning both levels 1 and 2, access control is one of the most significant CMMC domains, including practices as critical as limiting access to authorized users or devices, controlling the flow of controlled unclassified information or CUI, and introducing the use of encryption at various levels of the organization handling, storing, or transmitting CUI. At level 1, which is the basic level mandated for any Department of Defense supplier, there are 4 practices within the access control domain. And at level 2, there are an additional 18 practices, which altogether is 22 practices for access control. So our practices. First, we have authorized access control: limit information system access to authorized users, processes acting on behalf of authorized users or devices. So you want to identify the authorized users, the processes acting on behalf of those users, and system access is limited, and you want to make sure that they are actually limiting that access. So system access is limited to authorized users, and so on. Transaction and function control: limit information system access to the types of transactions and functions that authorized users are permitted to execute. So as you can see on the lower right, determine if the types of transactions and functions that authorized users are permitted to execute are defined, so we know what transactions and functions they are. And the system access is limited to the defined types of transactions and functions for authorized users. So we're actually putting that in place. External connections: we want to verify and control or limit connections to and use of external information systems. So we want to identify the connections to the external systems. The use of external systems is also identified. Connections to those systems are verified. The use of external systems is verified. Connections to external systems are controlled and limited, and the use of the systems are also controlled and limited. Control public information: control information posted or processed on publicly accessible information systems. So individuals authorized to post or process information on publicly accessible systems are identified, so we know who is authorized to do that. Procedures to ensure FCI is not posted or processed on publicly accessible systems are identified, FCI being federal contract information. A review process is in place prior to posting of any content, so someone is doing the checks and balances before actually posting. Content on publicly accessible systems is reviewed to ensure that it does not include federal contract information, and mechanisms are in place to remove and address the improper posting of federal contract information. So those were our level 1 practices. Now we have our additional 18 level 2 practices. So here we have control CUI flow. So we want to control the flow of controlled unclassified information in accordance with approved authorizations. So information flow control policies are defined. So we have policies to keep the flow controlled. Methods and enforcement mechanisms for controlling the flow of CUI are defined. Designated sources and destinations for CUI within the system and between interconnected systems are identified. Authorizations for controlling the flow of CUI are defined, and approved authorizations for controlling the flow of CUI are enforced. Separation of duties. We want to separate the duties of individuals to reduce the risk of malevolent activity without collusion. So we don't want privileged users doing non-privileged functions and non-privileged users performing privileged functions. So the duties of individuals requiring separation are defined. Responsibilities for duties that require separation are assigned to separate individuals. And access privileges that enable individuals to exercise the duties that require separation are granted to also separate individuals. Least privilege. Employ the principle of least privilege, including the for specific security functions and privileged accounts. So principle of least privilege being access is only the information and resources that are necessary for a legitimate purpose. So I only have access to complete the function of my job. So privileged accounts are identified. Access to privileged accounts is authorized in accordance with the principle of least privilege. Security functions are identified, and access to security functions is authorized in accordance with the principle of least privilege. Non-privileged account use. So use non-privileged accounts or roles when accessing non-security functions. Non-security functions are identified. Users are required to use non-privileged accounts or roles when accessing non-security functions. So you can even still be a privileged user performing a non-security function, but you can't be using a privileged account to do so. Privileged function. Prevent non-privileged users from executing privileged functions and capture the execution of such functions in audit logs. So privileged functions are identified. The non-privileged users are defined. Non-privileged users are prevented from executing those privileged functions. And the execution of privileged functions is captured in audit logs. So you can always go back and find out who performed which function, why, when, etc. Unsuccessful logon attempts. We want to limit unsuccessful logon attempts. The means of limiting unsuccessful logon attempts is defined, and the defined means of limiting unsuccessful logon attempts is implemented. Because obviously, trying to log into one system too many times is a red flag. Privacy and security notices. Provide privacy and security notices consistent with applicable CUI rules. So those notices required by CUI specified rules are identified, consistent, and associated with the specific CUI category, and privacy and security notices are displayed. Session lock. Use session lock with pattern hiding displays to prevent access and viewing of data after a period of inactivity. So the period of inactivity after which the system initiates a session lock is defined. Access to the system and viewing of data is prevented by initiating a session lock after the defined period of inactivity. And previously visible information is concealed via a pattern hiding display after the defined period of inactivity. Session termination. Terminate automatically a user session after a defined condition. So conditions requiring a user session to terminate are defined. A user session is automatically terminated after any of the defined conditions occur. We want to control remote access, so monitor and control remote access sessions, especially with so many people working from home. Remote access sessions are permitted. The types of permitted remote accesses are identified. Remote access sessions are controlled and they're also monitored. Remote access confidentiality. We want to employ cryptographic mechanisms to protect the confidentiality of remote access sessions. So cryptographic mechanisms to protect the confidentiality of remote access sessions are identified and they're also implemented. So you always want to make sure that it's noted what these types of mechanisms are, and then they're also following those policies or procedures that they've written for themselves. Remote access routing, route remote access via managed access control points. So determine if managed access control points are identified and implemented, and remote access is routed through managed network access control points. Privileged remote access. We want to authorize remote remote execution of privileged commands and remote access to security relevant information. So we want to determine if privileged commands authorized for remote execution are identified, security relevant information authorized to be accessed remotely is identified, the execution of the identified privileged commands via remote access is authorized, and access to the identified security relevant information via remote access is authorized. Wireless access authorization. Authorize wireless access prior to allowing such connections. So we just want to basically approve them, request and approve. Wireless access points are identified. Wireless access is authorized prior to allowing the connection. Mobile device connection, control connection of mobile devices. So pretty simple. Mobile devices that process, store, or transmit CUI, are identified. Mobile device connections are authorized, and the connections are monitored and logged. Encrypt CUI on mobile. So that, like what we were just talking about, the CUI that's kept on a mobile device or a mobile computing platform is going to be encrypted. So determine if mobile devices and mobile computing platforms that process, store, or transmit CUI are identified, and encryption is employed to protect CUI on those devices. Portable storage use, limit use of portable storage devices on external systems. So the use of portable storage devices containing CUI on external systems is identified and documented. Limits on the use of those devices containing CUI on external systems are defined. And the use of portable storage devices containing CUI on external systems is limited and defined. Limited as defined, excuse me. Now we'll just have a really quick quiz to check your knowledge. So question 1, describe CMMC practice identifier, and this one is at AC.L1-3.1.2, transaction and function control. And our answer for question 1 is D, limit information system access to the types of transactions and functions that authorized users are permitted to execute. Question 2, select the practice identifier associated with this CMMC practice. Verify and control or limit connections to and use of external information systems. And our answer here is A, external connections, which is found at AC.L1-3.1.20. Question 3, describe CMMC practice identifier, AC.L2-3.1.4, separation of duties. And our answer for question 3 is B, separate the duties of individuals to reduce the risk of malevolent activity without collusion. Question 4, select the practice identifier for this CMMC practice. Employ the principle of least privilege, including for specific security functions and privileged accounts. And our answer here, of course, is B, least privilege, which is found at AC.L2-3.1.5. And question 5, describe CMMC practice identifier AC.L2-3.1.19, encrypt controlled unclassified information or CUI on mobile devices. And our answer for question 5 is D, encrypt CUI on mobile devices and mobile computing platforms. Thank you.